Good morning. I am Lauren Cook, your Dean of College and Gap Year Advising at JCHS. Some of you I know, some of you I haven't had the pleasure yet, but we're getting started now. A few items of housekeeping just up top here. Everybody should be on mute for now. That's like the default in my room. I'm going to do just a little bit of content here up top. So it's great if folks aren't piping in at this moment, but we will have the bulk of the time for open Q&A. So I will let you know when it's a free for all. I love when cameras are on, but I also know that it's 8 a.m. So do what you need to do for you at this time. And just note that we are recording so that folks who aren't able to make it this morning can watch this later. So welcome to the 10th grade parent coffee. This is really bring your own beverage, but used to do this in person before COVID, but I decided to keep it on Zoom after, we've been done with the height of the pandemic, because I do think it's easier for folks, more equitable as we've got folks coming from all over the Bay Area, just so you don't have to commute to school to sit with me in person. And then of course we can record it and send it out to folks. So thank you for tolerating yet another Zoom session. Hopefully you don't have too many of these left in your lives at this point. And this is an annual event I do to sort of slowly start the college conversation. I find that parents and guardians in particular are sort of itching to start talking about what's coming, and that's totally fair. I do want to keep it a little bit casual as the process really starts in earnest next academic year, so later this year. And it's purposeful that I'm talking to just parents and guardians because I do think it's a little early for the bulk of our kids. Their job is to be high school students at this point and keep sort of laying the groundwork for their applications, and we can get into the weeds with them in a few months. So the college admission process, especially for families who haven't been through this before, it can inspire some excitement, some anxiety, some confusion. These are all valid responses. And those responses may be heightened if you didn't go to college or if you didn't go to college in the US. We have a complex system, which is both a strength, right? There's this huge diversity of options that you don't have in many other countries, but it's also kind of a headache because it is so complex to figure out where you want to apply and then how to do so. And not one size fits all. We have got students that are looking on a highly selective path, those that are sort of more broad access, folks that know that they're probably going to head off to community college and access the transfer option later. And those are all valid. And I love that JCHS students are on all of these paths. It makes my job really exciting. But I do want to plant the seed now with all of you that your messaging about college and perhaps some judgment around what's a good college or a bad college, like that gets internalized by your kids. And of course, then they go to school and sort of parrot that to each other. So this is a plea to you to help me try and keep our college advising community for the class of 2025 as healthy and judgment-free as possible for kids that are on all different paths. I talk to kids about how they're going to get a college prescription that's right for them, and they should really try and not take each other's prescriptions. So my goals for today, I'm just going to talk briefly here for 10 minutes or so up top, and then the bulk of the time is Q&A. I want to introduce myself to you for those of you who haven't worked with me before, give you a few tips to think about now that will help your kids as they approach this process, really around like building some independent skills that they will then be really applying in the next couple of months. Preview the path and the process that we have in place at JCHS. So you have a very general sense, I'm not going to get in the weeds, but a general sense of what's coming in junior year and senior year and how we kind of pace things out. And then open it up for Q&A. And that can be in the chat box, live, whatever, works for you. So I'll just start with me. Who am I? Who's Lauren? I am in wildly my 25th year in college admission. I actually have my 25th college reunion coming up in 2 months. I worked at a selective liberal arts college for 18 years before coming to the high school side as a high school counselor. I have read thousands of essays. I've conducted hundreds of interviews. I have given, hundreds of workshops, often with other college peers. So I have a pretty strong sense generally about what makes a good application. And I've worked on both coasts. I have a pretty extensive network of college admission colleagues on what we call sort of both sides of the desk, the college side and the high school side. So I have a pretty good sense of best practices and also where the resources are when I'm stuck on something and trying to figure out an answer for you or your child. And I'm a member of several professional organizations, both regionally here in California and then nationally. I hold some leadership roles. I'm regularly presenting to my peers on topics related to college admission. But I'm also, of course, also receiving a lot of training and updates related to this work to stay fresh. And there's been a lot changing in the last 2 or 3 years with the pandemic, which we can certainly get into. So trying to stay on top of that as much as I can. So that's me. I'm going to stop talking about me. It's awkward. And I'm going to share my screen and just talk a little bit now about some of those independent skills that I mentioned that I think will serve your kids well in the process. Some of them may already be highly attuned to these, but some of these may be new. So I just want you over the next few months to be thinking about ways that you can help them work on these. So the first, they're going to talk to a lot of adult strangers in the college admission process. So if your child has not had a lot of access or opportunity to have small talk with adults, I would think about purposeful ways over the next year or so that you can be doing that, whether that's family gatherings with neighbors at shul. We want them to develop some confidence with small talk and exhibiting their maturity and all of that will serve them well once they start interfacing with college admission reps and maybe even go into interviews by senior year. Related to that, drafting emails to adults. Now, some of our kids are already doing this, just writing, a faculty member an email, but email is starting to feel a little old to some of our, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. It's not something they have to do often. So helping them figure out how to craft what looks like a professional email. And if you are someone that's interfacing with, say, adults at JCHS around questions or concerns, now is a time to start nudging your kids to step in and have a voice with that. Because again, they will have to have some written interaction with college reps as they get into the process. Thinking about tracking their involvement is also important. If your child, and most sophomores in high school do not have a resume yet, but if your child doesn't have a resume or even just sort of a list started of some of what they've been involved with, now would be the time to start committing that to a Google Doc at a minimum, or sort of working on, a general resume at sort of maximum. Once they get into actually filling out applications in senior year, everything asks for an activities list. And so now would be a great time, and this is mostly the 4 years of high school. Although if you've been doing piano lessons since 6th grade or playing soccer since 4th grade, you can, to give the breadth of the time with that experience, be thinking further back. But to be thinking through, how do I spend my time? What role did I have then? What year was I involved in that? And just to start keeping track of it. It's going to make things so much easier senior year rather than having to sit down, which I inevitably do with a lot of students, and try and think back, okay, freshman year, how'd you spend your club block? What, sports did you do at which season? So, so start getting those down on paper now, and it'll make things a lot easier. Managing deadlines independently. This is a big one, and we don't always get there with everybody. But if your students are, struggling with some executive functioning, with maybe they don't have a planner or a good set of to-do lists, now is the time to start practicing that. And it's certainly something that they talked about in their freshman seminar last year, and hopefully have a couple of tactics in place. But there are a lot of deadlines with the admission process. And I find that for some of our more disorganized students, I'm like the backstop, the moment where they really run into a wall of, no, you can't get an extension with the college application deadline. Like, things are pretty hard and fast. So it is helpful if in the next year and a half, your students are really starting to get themselves organized, take these things seriously, and not need to have you micromanaging everything. I am, again, sort of a backstop about making sure that they're not missing deadlines into senior year, but this is a muscle they really need to start exercising for college admission and for just life. And then finally, think about finding some times to help them find their way around somewhere unfamiliar. And if your students commute to JCHS, they may have this down. This may be totally obviously if they're, figuring out Muni or Caltrain on their own. But if they're not, I find this to be a really important skill. So, on a Sunday, taking them to the Berkeley campus and saying, okay, can you find the library from here? Can you find the admission office? Maybe going to the BART and saying, okay, we're going to try and get to, Civic Center. You need to navigate us there. I remember my mom doing this with me when I was in high school. We went on like a girls' trip with her best friend and her daughter to St. Louis, and we got off the plane and my mom said, okay, Lori, you're going to help us find our way to the hotel. And I was livid. This is not something I was planning to do, but having to go sit and like read the transit map, and I didn't have Google Maps at that time to then, once we got off the public transit, find the hotel. But it's stuck in my memory at 46. So this, again, helping them navigate places on their own. This is another skill that they should be working on that's going to serve them well, whether, when you're going to tour a college campus or later in life. Okay, so let's get on to college admission explicitly and what's coming. So I'm going to start with junior year, which, is going to really start in August for all of you. Let me try and get the slide to work. There we go. So junior year at JCHS, late summer, we will start very lightly the process by getting your kids signed up for SCORE. Some of you may be in SCORE if you've got an older child, but SCORE is the software that we use to organize the college search for students. It's where they keep their lists and how they communicate with me about what they're interested in and where they have eventually applied. And it's also electronically on my side how I send their JCHS materials to colleges. Everything's done electronically now. Nothing really goes in the mail. So both your child and you, if you're not in SCORE already, will get an invitation in August to sign up. And then they can start noodling around and their college profiles in there and start sort of building things that they're interested in. But also if they just leave it empty in the fall, that's okay too. There are moments later on where I will help them with that. In the fall, for the first time, they will be invited to join college rep visits to JCHS. Juniors and seniors are allowed to attend these. We often have anywhere between like 60 and 90 colleges that come to visit. They have half an hour time slots and students can get out of class for these. And I really recommend that for juniors, you don't have to know anything about these schools. You don't have to know where you want to go. Just pick 5 schools and try and go to 5 visits. And it's helpful if you're choosing, say, a UC, a small liberal arts college, something on the East Coast, something on the West Coast. Just do some shopping. Just sit and listen to what's out there. And juniors really can, I think, engage in these relatively passively. Seniors obviously have done this already and now have more intentional questions and lists of where they want to be. So they often serve as good models for juniors who can just sit there and take in the information. Obviously engage if questions come up, but this is a great way to just get a sense of the landscape and what's out there. And then we will formally start the process with our kickoff, which right now I think is on the calendar for Wednesday, November 29th. You do not have to remember that. I will send more things. But that is the moment where we really start the process in earnest with your kids. And there will be questionnaires that go to everyone so I can get to know you, both your student and you. We'll have some initial college meetings, first one-on-one with me and the student, and then a family meeting if you'd like, and we'll get a draft college list going. Into the spring, if testing will be a part of your child's search, and I love that I can say if, and this is something we will work out this coming winter about whether it seems like you should continue thinking about standardized testing as a part of the process or whether you can step off the testing train. We've got a very test optional environment now and test free environment with the UCs and CSUs, but some folks will do testing in the spring. The last item in your junior English class for your kids will be to work on a college essay draft, and you should be exploring colleges in the initial list that we put together. And then next summer is also a great time, the summer of 2024, to conduct some college visits and start narrowing the list down. So there's obviously a lot of moving parts in junior year, but this is just the big overview, so you have a sense of what we're doing to sort of lay the groundwork. And then in senior year, again in the fall, I will have some application workshops. I also make videos for the kids, just short 5-minute videos about here's how you do the activity section in the UC application. So inevitably, when they are doing applications at midnight, they can have Miss Cook in their ear. There are also college visits again to the school, and they will now have a better sense of where they might be applying, have some really laser focused questions. And then we try and finalize that list. And I usually ask seniors somewhere around October 1st to have a sense in senior year of where they're applying. And then as we slide into the winter, we are finalizing writing and we are submitting applications. Many deadlines start in November. So if you want to know about writ large senior year, when does stuff really have to start being submitted? November 1st for early applications, very typical. And November 30th is kind of the universal UC CSU deadline. There are more deadlines into December, January, so they may keep applying into those winter months. And if it's applicable, applying for financial aid will also happen usually around the same time as you're applying for actual admission. So we'll want to be looking at those deadlines closely. And if you're thinking about a gap year, which is a whole spiel I can do later, folks have questions, gap year applications are typically due a little bit after the applications for admission. So January, February, March, that's a pretty common time. And then in spring, right now, March, this is the month where all the decisions come out, anything that's still outstanding and students haven't gotten yet. In April, they make a final decision. And usually by May 1st, they have to commit somewhere. So I support your students through every step of this. I want to make sure that's clear. You are not on your own with this. I send a lot of reminders, have a lot of meetings, read a lot of writing. But also know, because I am doing that, I am very busy right now with 11th and 12th graders, right? As we are working through these various stages of the process. So our relationship, the class of 2025, will really start formally in the winter of junior year. But of course, we are sort of starting to develop a relationship before then. I have been having course scheduling conversations, obviously, the last few weeks with many of your kids. We will have the kickoff this coming November on November 29th. And if your kids have periodic questions, they're welcome to pop in. Any of you can email me. I will ask families to sort of hold off on scheduling one-on-one meetings with me until we're in junior year because of the work that I'm engaged with now. And I know that you will appreciate me protecting my time once your kids, move forward into their junior and senior year. But for now, we can get started with some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will also just note, I'm going to see if I copied this right and can pop it in the chat. Yes, there is a long college advising handbook, 30 whole pages of information, answers to some of the more general questions you might have on the college advising website. So if you haven't accessed that yet, I just put the link in the chat. It's something for you to bookmark somewhere. You do not need to read all 30 pages now, but there's a lot of good general information, both about the college process and how JCHS approaches it there. So I'm going to look at the chat here and see what our first questions are. I'm sure it's on many folks' mind from the inside view at admission departments. What does test optional really mean? Are there two admit pipelines? I'm also interested in hearing about the gap year. Yes, great questions. So let's start with the test optional situation. Test optional is really earnestly test optional. And we, had a number of schools, 800 some schools that were test optional before the pandemic. It was a commentary on what they valued in the admission process, perhaps on their thoughts on equity and what they were already asking for in the process, giving them enough information to be able to make an admission decision. Now, COVID really disrupted all those other schools that were still requiring testing. And it did that mostly because students could not go and take a test, right? It wasn't safe to go to a classroom and sit before vaccines and all of that and take a test. And so most places were forced to go test optional, although not everywhere. I will say the states of Florida, and I'm forgetting what the other one is, might have been Georgia, because their college admission standards are set by their legislature. The legislature never made a move to undo that standardized testing as part of a requirement for admission. And you may be seeing there's a lot of legislature and government, interference happening right now with higher education in Florida. So they are doing all sorts of other things that you're not seeing in other states. But if you want to go to a public institution in Georgia or Florida, you still have to take a test. And other institutions, I think most notably MIT and Georgetown, who have always cared very much about testing, have moved back to being tests required. But most other institutions have been making sort of year by year statements, and more recently making statements that they are permanently now going to be test optional. I think Columbia sent one out about 3 or 4 days ago. And as someone who worked at a test optional institution before I came to JCHS, I can tell you colleges earnestly mean this. They've been getting more transparent with the data they're releasing, especially since COVID, in what percentage of the students that applied didn't submit a test, and then what percentage of the students they admitted didn't submit a test, and showing that those percentages are relatively similar. And when they're not, you can also see if they do sort of lean into testing. So this is something I'm watching. I have advice on 1 or 2 schools where I feel like, all things being equal, they probably want to see the test, but generally I think you can kind of take this kind of statement at face value. And again, I will help you and your child with their individual path in terms of what is going to work for them, and what I think they're going to need to do.
And Lauren, do they know if you've taken the test and you have not submitted?
They don't. So it used to be in before times that, like, the UCs of all places, now they don't even want to test, but would say, we want your whole testing history. You got to send us everything. Now we are very much not in that landscape. If you're going to submit a test, you are in the position of power of deciding what test you're going to send from which sitting. Some places super score. So if you got higher on English one time and higher on math at another, send both sittings and they will cherry pick the top score. So
but if you don't submit, they don't know if you've taken it or not.
Correct. And this also holds true for AP testing. So while a lot of places still say, like, send us your scores if you'd like to, if you feel like they reflect your academic ability. But if you take that AP test, you don't do as well as you would like, you can suppress that as well. Most colleges do not assume because you took a class, you took the test.
Yeah. So Lauren, question, I mean, have you looked at somewhat similar admit rate schools, and would you ever recommend kids to, like, run a trial where they send tests with some and not with others? I guess maybe it depends on the scores, but
yeah, I mean, I do. And I always want a student's college list to include schools that I feel like are a bit of a reach. They might be a little off profile, but let's give it a shot, that are right in their wheelhouse and that they're likely, if not sort of almost guaranteed, to be admitted to. So if you took a test, you might send scores to your likely schools and your possible schools, but maybe you don't send them to your reach school if they aren't, in the rarefied air of those test score averages. Yeah. So we do, and I can give advice on picking and choosing if you've got a test score, if we're actually going to use it.
Okay. My last question, I'm sorry. With no test scores, it seems like grades in classes get a very high emphasis.
Yep.
And I would imagine with 100,000 schools, I don't know how many schools there are in the US. The job of the admit is to, like, know what an A at JCHS means versus somewhere else. Where does JCHS rank?
That's a great question. So first of all, there are about 4,000 colleges and universities in the US. About 3,000 of those are four-year colleges. So still a lot. And we do have some regulars for JCHS, as you can imagine, places with higher percentages of Jewish students where the culture and the climate is going to be more accepting and open for our kids. The funnel narrows down a bit more as to where a lot of our students tend to apply. I I find that those schools know us. I wouldn't say that colleges tend to sort of rank high schools. I think what they are trying to do is figure out within your context, and our context is specific, it's different from Lowell's or from universities or, you know, whatever else, within the context of JCHS and our curriculum and what they've seen in the past, what has the student chosen to do? What kind of rigor have they chosen to pursue? How have they done in those classes? And that's what they're kind of assessing them on. I will say, I think JCHS is really highly thought of in the college admission world. I was a recruiter to the campus for 12 years before I took the job there, because we had a lot of JCHS students that ended up on my campus that were terrific. Some of them worked in the Office of Admission. Like, I knew that these were really quality students. And, you know, we do have the reputation for being a mensch factory. But for places or new reps that don't know us, every time they get an application from JCHS, there's a transcript there, but there's also a JCHS college profile that is also on the College Advising JCHS website if you want to take a look at what that includes. It's typically been a one-page, two-sided thing that's sort of an overview of the school, the curriculum, understanding the Jewish studies of it all and what's required of students, and that those classes are serious academic coursework, the whole curriculum they have to choose from, and then the type of colleges that our kids have gone to in the last 5 years. It's now got a one-page addendum to get into the COVID of it all and talking about what we did during the quarantine year and all the rest. But so they get a little snapshot of us to help put the transcript that they've got in context. But I will say, if you take nothing else from today, you've got sophomores right now. They are very much still kind of in the beginning of their academic record. It's not even halfway complete. And the transcript has always been the most important piece of the application, regardless of test scores. So both the classes they're choosing to take, which, you know, our graduation requirements line up with UC eligibility and all the rest. So you don't have to get wildly creative beyond what we require of you to be a solid applicant. But those grades matter. And I think that students sometimes have a misperception about, you know, that they can slack here or there, or that the JS stuff isn't as important or whatnot, but everything matters. And I don't say that to create anxiety or to put extra pressure on, but just to make sure that we're all informed. And wherever your kids land, we can work with that, and there is a school for them. But doing the best they can is important. I am going to turn over to Robert, who's patiently had his Zoom hand up. So what's your question, Robert?
Hi, thank you. So we've been through the college process with our older kids, so we have some familiarity, but the difference now is, and my question is really, what about with your guidance for kids who do have learning challenges, and being able to understand really which colleges, you know, have services and support where it'll be a good match for a bright kid, but where, say, executive function issues are challenging.
Yep.
How do we know which schools have good supports?
Yep. Super common question. We do have a lot of students at JCHS with various diagnoses, complex learning profiles. There are schools for them. And so there's a couple of ways you can go about this. There are certainly some great resources online and in physical books. I have in my office a couple of books. I think one of the best is a Princeton Review put together book that profiles about 250 or 300 colleges that are known for having really strong learning support. And it goes state by state, and they give some details in there about each institution. I certainly have a good sense of some of the really heavy hitters. The University of Arizona actually comes up all the time because of their SALT program. It's a really award-winning set of resources, and you apply to SALT separately in addition to the University of Arizona. So I will, as I'm doing sort of the initial intake with your kids next winter, and we're making that initial college list, be filtering through my college lens, great places with strong learning support, and also where faculty are understanding, where there's a lot of scaffolding around helping students through the process. And your student may also be someone that wants to think about a gap year. We'll get into that question. I see there's more in the chat box as well, because that's another year of maturity, of growing skills, of independence, so that they can really hit the ground running once they arrive on a college campus. But I've got a lot of resources for that. And Dr. Neufeld and the learning support folks will also be useful with testing accommodations if they decide to test. Again, a lot of our students with complex learning profiles may now have the joyous option to just decide not to do the standardized testing route, and that's okay. Many of the schools with really strong learning support abandoned standardized testing as a requirement years ago because it was not helpful for the profile student they were serving. So I hope that helps to know. Gap year stuff, let's get into it. So anywhere between a quarter and a third of JCHS graduates will choose to pursue a gap year. Most of those folks are headed off to Israel, but not everyone exclusively. We got folks that do language immersion programs in other countries, sort of like rustic pathways, outdoorsy, cultural immersion. We've had students work on macadamia nut farms in Hawaii and do search and rescue in Iceland. There are other options, but Israel is a big focus for obvious reasons. And I think colleges love to receive students who have been on a gap year, because as I just noted, you do arrive on campus a little bit more focused, mature, independent. You are better able to take advantage of what is now a very expensive experience and not sort of burden through freshman year, not really sure what you want to do, trying things out, perhaps being so excited to be away from home for the first time that those grades might be a little shaky there in that first semester. So the gap year can help you get some of that out of your system and arrive at college ready to really do the work. The process with gap years, I generally advise our students to go through the college admission process in senior year with the rest of their classmates, even if they are really sure they want to do a gap year, for a number of reasons. One, it's the peer culture, it's what folks are doing. And so do it while you've got that energy and intention around you. Do it while you've got my support physically with you, although I certainly help kids while they're in Israel on a gap year, or if they decide, to transfer later on. But while you've got ready access to me and to your teachers to write recommendation letters and all the rest. And most colleges, although not all, most colleges are happy to grant a deferral for a year. So you get in somewhere, you say, I want to go here. And then you say, I want to spend the next year doing the Aardvark program in Israel. I'm going to have an internship and take a little Hebrew and travel around the country. And they're going to say, fantastic. We will see you next year, probably check in with you in March or so and make sure you still intend to enroll. The exceptions to that, the California State Universities, the CSU system, so think about a Cal Poly, a Sonoma State, a San Francisco State, they, in my experience, do not grant gap years, full stop. Doesn't mean you shouldn't still apply as a senior, especially if you're not sure of if you're going to take a gap year. But that application is also conveniently the fastest one to complete. It takes about 30 minutes. All they want is your grades and curriculum. So if you need to do that again, if you do decide to do a gap year and do that again, it's low stakes and low commitment from you. And it's something I can help with remotely. We also are in a place where some of the UCs are perfectly fine with a gap year and some are not. Almost all will say on the website, we do not grant gap years. But then there's fine print that says, unless it's religious or military. And they usually interpret without much of our help going to Israel as religious. So we let them do that. So we've had students, in the past couple of years, UCLA, Santa Cruz, Davis, a broad swath of the UCs be able to still engage in a gap year and then enroll in that UC when they come back. The applications for gap years, you tend to start completing them and you do have to sort of apply. It's a much shorter thing than the actual college application, but you do have to apply to these programs. And some have very specific deadlines. It's usually women's seminaries that start earliest in December of the senior year. But then other programs, can go all the way up until 2 weeks before you leave. So we found, especially with the class of 2020 during the COVID year, there's a lot of pivoting as people were like, yeah, I'm not going to go to UCLA at my dining room table, so they wanted to find a gap year that summer as we were all in quarantine, and had a pretty easy time finding a lot of experiences. So I think it's great. It's also not for everybody. Some people want to just keep that momentum up and slide right into college, and that's okay. But know that I'm going to want to at least float the conversation with your family as we get started with the process. There's a question in the chat about, will you be able to assist if some of our children's stretch goals include English and Scottish universities? Absolutely. We always have students applying to schools in the UK, in Canada, in Israel. This year, I've got, someone who really wants to do fashion in Amsterdam. I've got someone who's very intent in the junior class on going to college in, where is it? Antwerp. So anyway, yes. And if I'm not an expert in the particular country we're looking at, we will figure it out together. But yes, the UK schools are a very common and well-tread path. Now, I will say some of the international schools can be a bit more dependent on test scores. So that is another place where many of them, but not all, have returned to wanting some kind of testing, because there's no other real way to figure out a standardized, curriculum between multiple countries. So that will be a part of our conversation at some point as well, if they're looking abroad. I do want to pause. I know Allie Brody had emailed me saying she is doing the carpool, but wanted to be sure she could ask a question. So I'm going to just call on Allie so she knows that it's her time.
Oh my gosh, Lauren, thank you so much. Actually, I think my question was addressed, so I am very satisfied. I will pass the mic back.
Amazing. Okay, thank you so much. So Alan Schusterman, you have your hand up.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much. I want to ask a question around, you have such a stellar reputation. I mean, everyone talks about how much you help. I have a question though, is there any value in also getting private college counseling? I know there's a trend in that. It's not something I have any familiarity with. I didn't do that when I applied to college, but I know there's a lot of talk about that.
Yep.
You obviously have a lot of students to deal with. Is there value in that, or is it unnecessary?
Thank you so much for asking that question. I have a couple of different answers, and I will also direct you. There is a page in the college handbook on independent counselors. And so I will say this, the independent counseling community sort of rose up initially, 15 or 20 years ago, as this process got more selective, and as a lot of states, California included, were cutting budgets to high schools. And so a lot of the college counseling staff in particular, there wasn't room in the budget for it anymore. And so you had all these public school students that were not getting advice as the process was getting more complicated. And so, of course, capitalism loads the vacuum. So we're going to have people cropping up to offer to help. A lot of those budgets have been reinstated, but of course, the process is what it is. There's a lot of white noise in the media, makes everybody feel like, this is something maybe I need to throw money at. I will say that your JCHS tuition pays for me and a lot of help. And so I think most of our families do not need an outside person. And I will say that the quality can vary wildly. There are folks who have done jobs like mine, who have worked at colleges, who are really highly attuned to everything. And this is their kind of easing into retirement plan, and they're terrific. And there are folks who guided one student into college, their own child, and now they know about college admission and have hung a shingle and are charging $300 an hour. So, and then everything in between. So generally, I'm going to say this is not something you need, but I will also say sometimes students with the more complex learning profiles that have some executive functioning challenges that might benefit from weekly structured check-ins and meetings, that is not always something I'm going to be able to do, right? So that is a place where I would fully endorse and be happy to partner with someone, and know that if you decide that you want to have an outside person, I am happy to partner with them. You should grant them the permission to speak with me about the process, because I don't want the student to feel in the middle of like, am I reporting to mom or dad on this, right? And there are some folks that might just get a little writing advice if you feel like this is not in your child's wheelhouse. Again, I do so much work, essay writing with our kids. I am happy to. It is part of my job. I know what colleges are looking for, but I also, am happy if there's, a writing coach they're working with to partner with them as well. So I leave it up to you, but I'm going to say generally, I don't think this is something that most of our families need. But if you do feel like for one of the reasons I just mentioned, you want to look for someone, feel free to check in with me for advice or for vetting someone, because I also have a sense of both the really great people in the area and the like, oh my God, red flags. Like I've watched families fire folks because of shady sort of practices. Also remember that I'm going to be the point of contact with colleges. They are going to be colleges. I say this not for me, but for colleges. They are going to look and see who's the college counselor at that high school. And that's who I'm going to call with questions and all the rest. So it really behooves your child to have a strong relationship with me, regardless of anyone else you might have working on the team as well. So,
well, Lauren, thank you so much. I have one super quick question. I just want to address something we talked about before, which is around testing.
yep.
The question is really around how do we determine if we think it's going to be useful or not now? Because I'll just give you my personal, for our son, I felt like he has a lot of room he did fine on the practice test, but I think he could do significantly better, but it's going to require I think it's going to require a lot of work to improve. And I think that would probably have to start now or soon. How do we what are the scores that we should be thinking about? What is a target area where it's actually helpful, and how do we make that decision? Because it's going to be an investment. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how to assess that.
So a couple of things, yes, your children in theory, although, one or two kids tend to opt out of it each year, took the PSAT last fall at school. They will do so again in junior year. Know that right now it's too early to think about test prep, partially because these tests, it's just not a curricularly appropriate time. Unless your student is really advanced in math and English, they are still learning content for the test, right? Curricularly over the next year. So they will naturally see some sort of a bump taking the PSAT again in junior year, because curricularly and developmentally, they're in a different place. But I really, really, really would caution folks about thinking about test prep this summer, because it's too soon for most students. We will do more sort of diagnostic thinking about testing in the fall. You'll have the PSAT in the middle of October. And then we always do a practice ACT test at the school. It's an opt-in, it's not required, but I really strongly encourage folks to take it if you think testing will be a part of your process, because the ACT is a little bit different than the SAT in terms of content, timing, all the rest. And so one test might lend itself to your child's strengths more than another. So we do want to have both of those practice test scores to sort of parse out if one is naturally going to be a little bit easier for them to succeed than others. And then we figure out, okay, well, what are your aspirations? Because if you are thinking about some of the most highly selective institutions or places that require test scores, then yeah, it's very important we sort of figure out between those two tests, what's going to be the one that they're going to run with. We pick one. There's no reason to take both, focus on both, prep for both, and then do prep through the winter of next year. To figure out what is considered a good score at certain colleges, most schools have either an average admitted school test score on their website for the SAT and the ACT, or they have a middle 50%. And so that's what you're aiming for in that range. Now, I will say in this test optional environment where you don't have to submit a test score, some of the logical stuff you would presume is happening. The kids with the higher test scores are submitting and the kids with the lower test scores are not. So averages, middle 50%, they are all sneaking upwards at some of the most highly selective places. So you're going to see, at some of the Ivies, 1550, on the SAT, or a 34 on the ACT. The ACT is out of 36. And I will say for some students, that's going to be unattainable. That is beyond their score ceiling. All of us as humans have sort of a score ceiling. You can prep, you can take the test a couple of times, but at some point you're going to plateau. And so this is a fine, nuanced conversation that I have with families about how much sort of banging the head against the wall do we want to do. And if you're not in that zone, what's the next zone that, and those are probably going to be the possible and likely schools for you. So these are things we'll get to one by one, but know that this fall, we will really get into the testing conversation more seriously and have those diagnostic tests and look at those results carefully.
Do you have a list of those schools with the SAT scores?
You can just Google anything on the web. So if you Google Cornell SAT averages, if you Google Brandeis SAT averages, everybody's got a profile of their first year class. So right now it's still going to be the class admitted last year. You'll see all sorts of stats like average GPA, average test scores, all of that. So if there's certain schools that are on your mind in this moment, go straight to their website.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And I know we've got a couple in the chat. I'm going to just look to that before we get to David. Okay, curious if you have recommendations on the best things to do during the summer to prepare and enhance applications. Great question. So first of all, I will say there's no silver bullet to summer activities generally. Colleges do not have to see that you did an internship or that you pursued a research project or whatever. You can work at a summer camp. You can be a Subway sandwich artist. You can bag groceries at Safeway. All of these are great things. And I don't think colleges generally are placing a judgment on the student who has to work over the student who was able to spend $3,000 to spend a week at Stanford doing like a chemistry camp. What they are interested in is that you did something that's not just like hanging out on your couch on your lawn with your friends. And let's be clear, I want your kids to do some of that because summer should also be a little bit of decompression. But having a couple of activities, whatever those might be, whatever makes them happy and has them doing something, that's great. What colleges will place a judgment on is like how they maybe talk about it in their application, why they made those choices. If your student is interested in sports management and they coached at a YMCA, summer camp for middle schoolers over the summer, that's terrific. That's like building their narrative. So I always want students to sort of think about what's the most them they can be, if that makes sense. And so if they are not someone who's super psyched about having a coding internship, with a local tech company, don't do it. do something that they're going to get excited about because it's their summer. In terms of preparing for applications, really, it's the summer before senior year that ideally they are doing some application work. And know that I work all summer. I am not on sort of a faculty contract. I'm a 12-month contract at JCHS because college advising does not stop with graduation. So going into senior year, I am often, for the students that are really on it, reviewing writing remotely through Google Docs. I am checking over activities lists. Once applications that are updated and open on August 1st, the kids that are really on it are starting to complete them, and I'm helping them and double checking things. So that's more summer of senior year. It doesn't mean they have to like stay home the summer of senior year, but to allow some thought around, I need a little time to be working on stuff. It's always helpful to start senior year having front loaded a little bit of that work because you got competing priorities between keeping your grades up, maybe testing another time, completing applications, et cetera. Okay, and then Doug had a question about everyone makes their own choices for college counseling. Oh, this is like talking about how great I am. We're going to skip that. Okay, awkward. David Horowitz, you have your hand up.
All right, thank you. And this has been very helpful, so I appreciate it. Just one quick question is, I know things have changed from when we applied. I mean, how many schools do you expect each student to apply to? And what's a good number?
Great question. So JCHS students on average apply to 10 schools. That's what comes out in my computer data each year. Now and I will say 8 to 10 is what's really reasonable. You will read news reports of people applying to 30 colleges. That is a dumpster fire in action when students do that, because you're not doing anything well. You don't know these schools specifically. You're spending a lot of extra money. And a lot of times I think there's an approach like it's the lottery. Like the more applications I put into Reach schools, somehow the odds are I'll get into one of them. But the odds are, if your profile is off for a Reach school one time, that's also true 30 times, right? So I think the best kind of college list has some really purposeful, intentional applications where you've gotten to know the school. You're able to express to the school in your application why you are a match for them and they're a match for you, that you know something about them. And some schools take this to the extreme. I mean, Tulane is a great example. You will see they have a teeny tiny admit rate at this point. And I know some of you have maybe not thought about Tulane in 30 years, are like, that's the party school in New Orleans. Not at all. They've got like an 8% admit rate. They're doing amazing things like post-Katrina. They had all this service and connection with the community that they're doing. But Tulane also really cares about if you know them. And they are tracking something called demonstrated interest as well. So have you been on a tour? Did you open an email? Did you attend the rep visit to your school? I literally had the Tulane rep email me this year and say, we just deferred one of your students because he's had no engagement with us. And that was someone who applied to a lot of schools. So knowing the school well, being intentional, and then having within those 8 to 10 schools, some likelies, some possibles, some reaches. And we see what happens. I'm never going to tell a kid they can't apply somewhere. You know, I want you to shoot for the moon if that's your dream. I don't want in 10 years you'd have big regrets you didn't try. But I also want you to go to college. So we're going to have some things on the list by hook or by crook that we think you're going to get into. So I hope that helps. And then there was another question in the chat.
It's
yes.
Sorry, it's just me making a joke.
No, I know. Oh, the varsity blues of it all. That made everything.
By the way, like, I think COPA should prevent colleges from tracking our minor children opening emails.
I mean, also, there's a lot of things about the process that I'm going to say are not equitable or maybe a little suspect, but yes, I mean, these are things that they track. This is what the student information systems can do. So yeah. Was there another question? And Doug, I should thank you for your lovely compliment. So yeah, thank you. I'll name it's 8 of 9, and we are going to stop at 9 either way. But do we have any other burning questions, other topics we did not cover? Anything I missed in the chat? Yes, thoughts around dealing with letdown when stretches aren't reached. Yes, those that have a junior or senior received an Atlantic article from me last week on just this topic, which I tend to send out every year, about the tagline is very clickbaity, you know, about, you know, my really great white child didn't get into a school. What do I tell them about disappointment and that life isn't fair? And the answer is from a therapist who is saying, well, we could start by reframing things that life isn't, you know, fair, because you don't want your child to go through the world thinking that like everything's against me. This is a hard process, and it's something that I talk with students all the way through the next year and a half about, that faculty at JCHS are very aware of. I will have Ms. Beck coming to talk with the junior families later this month for our next coffee with Ms. Cook, because disappointment is a part of life. It's tough. It's going to happen. And this may be the first time for some kids where they really, experience a hard no. And so trying to prepare them for that and trying to prepare you for that is important, because this is a moment where they can figure out how they want to respond to not getting what they want. And I do a lot of talking about how this isn't personal. This is about numbers. It's about stats. It's about space at a certain institution at a certain place and time. There's also the psychological stuff going on about, why do we want a place that might not want us? What is it about the elusive elite reach schools with these teeny tiny admit rates that make us think, yeah, that should be the goal? If someone is admitting 5% of their students, it's sort of like, well, if it's pouring outside, if there's a 95% chance of rain, would you not take an umbrella because you presume you're going to be part of the 5%, somehow that isn't getting wet? So you have to be talking to them in a balanced way about what if this goes great and what if it doesn't. And I find that the counseling part of my job is a lot of listening when disappointment comes up, and to hold back on the urge to fix things. I will try and fix things eventually because that's my job. But early on, whether it's looking at a profile of a school and them having to come to the hard reality that maybe their GPA is just going to make it you might as well set $70 on fire rather than submit that application, or when they actually get the hard no. And I also try and work very hard for students to be conscious of each other. We had a very tricky situation in the senior class this year where they are behaving like menches when they both applied to the same school and got different results. But inevitably, hard stuff is going to happen. So I think the best thing to do is for us to have good communication with each other, that I will keep you informed on, what I'm seeing at school, and you keep me informed on what's happening at home, and massage the situation as best we can. But just know now that this will likely be a part of the process for all of your kids. I don't know if that was a real set answer, but that's the best I can do. 4 minutes left. Any other questions? This is a lot of information out the gate. We will not have to be this much in the weeds for the next few months. Right. I will again say, you will get some score information later this summer. I generally tend to hold an open Zoom like this with both students and parents at the very beginning of next year, before things have gotten nuts for me, just to sort of clear out another set of questions if things are coming up, if we've got big testing news or something that happens over the summer. And then we'll just kind of do a slow slide into things in the fall and have them go to some visits and get ready for that launch in November. But I'm excited to get to know you and your kids better.
Hey, Lauren.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot. So on for AP tests.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to, AP out of a class, obviously they would have to submit a score, right?
Yep.
But are those scores ready in time for the college admissions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes and no. It depends on when you took the class. So if some of your students are in AP US history, they will take that test in May. It will be ready, right? Junior year AP classes, they will be ready. Senior year AP classes, they will not. AP test scores will not factor into the admission process. The fact that your student is taking an AP class absolutely will. They get curriculum points for that. There are mid-year grades, midterm grades that we end up sending depending on their application plans. So grades in the class matter, but they will get those test scores back typically in late June or early July after graduation. And so then it's just a factor of sending it to the registrar's office at the school you're enrolling at, and do you get credit for that class?
But you would AP US history, you would include that score in the admission.
If you are happy with your score. So that's the other thing. I'm going to always suggest that sophomores and juniors, if you're in an AP class, to just take the test.
Yeah.
There's no harm, no foul to it. There's no permanent record where you have to list it. If you take the AP US history test and you get a 5, we're absolutely submitting that. If you get a 2, we're not submitting that. And both of those are okay, right? We're just seeing how things go. But by senior year, when you have more of a sense of where you're going and what your test history has been, I will say the UCs, for example, they will only take one AP English test score. So if you're taking AP English language and AP literature, like terrific, you should take both of those classes. But if you got a 4 or 5 on that AP language exam in junior year, you don't really have to take the senior if you're going to end up going to a UC, right? So I make some decisions with students in senior year about whether they actually need to and want to take those AP tests. But everything else I would just take, and we see what happens. We decide later what you're going to submit.
Got it.
Yep. All right. Thank you for all the thank yous in the chat. Thank you for all being here so early this morning. I will send a recording out later this week. It's 1 of 9, so I think we'll call it now. But thank you for being here, and more soon. As we get
Lauren, can you send just the PowerPoint, just the presentation?
I absolutely can. I will do that as soon as we hang up here. All right. Have a great day,
Lauren,
everyone.
thank you.
Thank you so much.